Welcome to Lynchburg Aesthetic, an exploration of how the design of a town and the fashion of its people feed into one another. Today, I'm interviewing a good friend of mine who I've had on my hall for a couple of years.
This is Christopher.
Chris has a very unfortunate name, so you'll have to forgive me for having to leave it out.
I think I'm going through my fifth year now of being here in Lynchburg, here at Liberty, my fifth year being a Liberty student.
I'm sure this will shock many of you over the course of this interview, but you all should know that Chris isn't actually an art major, or a fashion major, or fine arts, or anything like that. Chris is going to school to work with computers and do cybersecurity, information technology. But what Chris doesn't have in higher education in the arts, he makes up for, more than makes up for, in his hunger and his desire to dive into things wholeheartedly. If you were to go into his room, you would see stacks of books. Many he's read, many he hasn't. Many he's read partway through. Maybe he's going over them again. But something becomes very clear when you talk with Chris. He is very thoughtful and always willing to learn. What Chris offers is a mind that has a wealth of knowledge behind it, that he's gained because he wanted to gain it. From books, from Instagram accounts, from YouTube videos. I'm sure it will shine through to you all, but Chris has some very insightful things to say.
Now that's love. I mean, real love.
My hometown, I'm from a town called Woodbridge, up in Northern Virginia, and when it comes to there, it's a very I would say it's like a street influence style to the surrounding area. Now, for me, as much as I talked about like the sheltered sort of types of people back then, like I noticed that because of me inherently like being in a some sense sheltered myself, just because I grew up in a private school there, and so as much as the surrounding area has its own sort of like style and influences and different stuff like that, because of the school I went to, I decided not to partake in any of that, and so even being there as long as I was, I actually none of that really affected me except for the little bits that permeated into my school. Most of that was shoes. So a lot of that was like basketball shoes, Jordans, and different stuff like that were like the main things that I sort of saw people like have different shoes on every day, and basically like that was my introduction to sneaker culture back then. But even though I didn't even know the word for it, so it's hard for me to say really in a few words what the style really counted. I just know that sneaker culture was a big part of the area where I was from, and I was influenced by it and the shoes that I bought, even though I didn't really know the names and different stuff like that. Could just see like, oh, this is the shoe that I've seen other people wear, and grab that rather than really knowing whether it's like the history behind it or even the name of the shoe itself.
If you know Chris, like I know Chris, this is hard to believe now if you met him post college. We'll get into how his shift happened, but Chris wears almost exclusively Jordans now. I think I've seen him in a pair of Tims. I've definitely seen him in a pair of Tims. But other than that, it's a blue and white pair of Jordan 1 highs. So, how exactly does a kid from a private school who doesn't know what sneaker culture is or what Jordans are get to a carefully considered man who reads about fashion, who watches videos about fashion, and wears almost nothing but Jordans? I'll let Chris tell his story.
Yeah, so most of that happened once I actually got to Lynchburg. Most of like the change when it came to my fashion happened when I came to Lynchburg. When I first got here, I have pictures of me just in regular like button-down shirts and slacks and stuff like that, and pretty much just like wearing that all the time as sort of like an outfit. Um, because that's all I really knew, just because I can never develop a sense of fashion for myself other than just the basics. Because my school had a uniform, and so having that, you only have like a couple of days a year where you're able to wear like dress down Fridays and stuff like that, where you're able to like put your own stuff together. Um, and so not having so many opportunities to develop that, like I didn't really have a sense of it until I got to school and I realized that there's a lot more ways to put clothes together. Um, and I think it was my sophomore year where I had friends that I lived with who I could tell had a sort of sense of fashion to them. Like it was just something I could recognize, even though I didn't understand it. And so, growing closer with them, they decided to sort of help me out when it came to like helping me understand, aesthetics, how different colors work together, and different stuff like that, and also just like different types of clothes. Like before then, I didn't even know what joggers were. Like legitimately, I never knew what they were. I knew what sweatpants were, and that was it. And so when they introduced joggers to me, I was like, wait, these are like comfortable like sweatpants, but they're of a slimmer sort of style to them, and so they're like more respectable because of that. And I was like, man, this is actually really cool. And then with that came in new sneakers and different stuff like that that I was introduced to, like more Jordans and different stuff like that, and starting to recognize the story behind those. Um, just like the story of like Jordan himself, and like how that influenced sneakers and different stuff like that. Um, and then so that sort of led to me sort of copying sort of like what they taught me and different stuff like that. But it wasn't so much me figuring it out as much as just me copying them. And that wasn't until later on where I started discovering like different designers and different like brands that I actually like would be able to look at and say like, hey, I actually like the look of that, not because like I think it's cool, but it's just like that's just something I'm starting to recognize, and just like, hey, that's cool. And a lot of that was like fear of God. Um, Actually, I would say it was just mainly fear of God, like seeing the sort of minimal aesthetic that they had and how they sort of kept it simple, um, to simple color palettes and simple silhouettes. Sort of was a way that made it more accessible to me
At
because
this point,
you think of
I would
fashion
like
and
to
stuff like that, it
interject.
can get very
Sorry,
overwhelming
I know
very
you want to
easily,
hear Chris, not me,
because there's so many
but
different
I think it's
combinations
important to
and
do
different stuff like
a
that.
quick lesson for those who are not as
Because
into
what stuff
fashion
works together,
as
but when
Chris
you
or
have
I.
like a simple color
Uh,
palette and simple
Fear of
silhouettes
God
to work with, it
is
makes it a lot
a
more
fashion
accessible.
label, American fashion label, started by Jerry Lorenzo
And a lot easier
that
to like
has
apply.
brought back loungewear
And so
and denim
seeing
wear,
that, and then also combining
very
it with
much
the
so.
books I was reading,
A couple years ago, they were
um,
very big. If you've ever
ended
heard
up
the
starting
term
my
Jerry
collection for
Boy,
years.
it's talking about people,
Where I was like starting to
typically
understand
Christian
that sort of
people, because
minimalism
Jerry Lorenzo is a
and
Christian,
like simplicity.
hence Fear of God, who were big into his
But then
stuff.
now
So
sort of
in
like
the last couple of years,
not as much
his
allowing the
silhouetting,
graphics
the
and
layered
the
kind of
different
identity
styles,
that he's created
now stuff that
has
does
had a
allow for
tremendous
simpler and
impact
stuff that like
on the current state
more
of
subtly works
American
together.
streetwear. So, anyway, enough of me talking.
So it
Back
sort
to
of was a way
Chris.
that made it more accessible to me, because you think of fashion and stuff like that, it can get very overwhelming very easily. There's just so many different combinations and different stuff like that that can be introduced to you, and so you don't even know what stuff works together. But when you have like a simple color palette and simple silhouettes to work with, it makes it a lot more accessible, a lot like easier to understand and a lot easier to like apply. And so seeing that, and then also combining with different books I was reading, um, in those like next couple of years, um, where I was like starting to implement aspects of like minimalism in my life and trying to make my life simpler. Um, like sort of led me down the road of like not as much loud graphics in my sort of style. Not stuff that like draws a lot of attention, but stuff that like is simple and subtly works together. Um, just for the sake of simplicity, like I'm trying to get more stuff that's high quality, so that I don't have to constantly be bringing on the anxiety in myself of like, oh man, does different stuff work together? Or like, oh man, this stuff's out of trend and different stuff like that. And try to bring it together in just a much simpler and more minimal way. Um, so yeah, I would say like a lot of those influences come from like Fear of God, in the way like Jerry Lorenzo has sort of like brought different stuff together in a very like minimal but like almost timeless way.
Chris is throwing a lot of things around in this story. He's talking about timelessness, he's talking about a closet that works together. But what exactly does he look like today? What has this story actually led him to? I asked Chris, how would he describe his own style right now?
I think it makes me um, do different stuff. I've like looked at different brands and stuff like that. Like I can see the sort of through lines through all of them. Like what are the different simple things that work in all those? Like what are the simple things that they all develop? Um, and when it comes to like stuff I put on every day, it basically just it makes me want to just be comfortable in what I'm wearing and not really worrying as much about what others are thinking, um, but in a different way than what I mentioned earlier when it came to like how some people can not care about what people think, but then it makes them not care about like how their stuff works together. I think it's both possible to not allow um, not allow certain trends to influence you while also like understanding that clothes work together in a certain way, um, and make it so like you can look at yourself in the mirror and say like, hey, I like how this works together, and that's what matters. um, so I think there's both a sense of being able to say like, oh, this objectively like makes sense from a color palette perspective, from a silhouette perspective, um, and if there's someone that maybe disagrees just because of their experiences like of how the stuff works together, like that's okay. That doesn't mean that what I'm wearing is inherently bad. And that was like a big lesson for me. And then also just like, I don't need a new a new kind of shirt every day, pretty much. I'm fine with wearing like the same sort of like black or white shirt every day, with different pants or something like that. I'm fine with reusing stuff because if it works, it can work in multiple outfits. It doesn't like if something can only be worn with like a very specific very specific pants or something like that, it's not something that can be practical for me. So I think that pretty much covers it.
While Chris was talking and describing how he dresses now, he talks about not having to stress. He talks about a closet that works together. He talks about wearing simple things. He wears a lot of blanks, if you know Chris. He's the one that put me on to Rue Porter, who makes high quality blanks and just directly sells them. And for Chris, this is what he likes to wear. It's something that he finds comfort in, and it's something that he sees himself wearing every day. But as he was describing it all, it made me think about something. Remember, as Chris was describing his hometown and the fashion of his hometown, he mentions how, growing up, he was in private school and he always had to wear a uniform. Now, I went to a private school for most of my high school career, and thankfully, we didn't have a uniform. But they used to. They had to wear khakis, a button down shirt, used to be a tie, and some simple shoes. But what is it about a uniform? Some would say that uniform is not style. I'm here to tell you the opposite, really. For Chris, I see a complete circle. Someone who went from uniform to uniform. The difference is who made it. In high school, Chris's uniform was dictated by a superintendent, a board of parents and faculty members, and whoever else might have been involved. But now, as Chris got to Lynchburg and discovered more things and discovered what he truly liked, he was able to find out what things can I include into my closet that I would wear every day. And that led him to the same kind of things: blanks, sweaters, Jordans, straight leg pants. Sorry if I'm describing your style a little too much, Chris, but you get the idea. If you see Chris on a given day, he's probably wearing something similar to the last day. And I think for many of us that's true. A uniform, when chosen by the individual, is fashion, is style. And I think many people would agree with that. Why is it that so many people attach themselves to their own kind of uniform? I think it has a little something to do with what Chris mentioned earlier. It's timelessness. I want to drop off a little quote for y'all that Chris gave me, and I think it encapsulates what he has talked about and what we will talk about.
I think that I think that when it comes to like fashion and architecture, we're always on the search for timeless, and yet um, we can never seem to find it. And I think that just sort of shows some part of the human condition, that we're never truly satisfied when it comes to like the things we find. Like we're always trying to find something different, always trying to find something better. And I don't know. I think that's just something I've been thinking about. I think that's just like some very deep like food for thought to be thought about when it comes to just like you know what is it that we're actually pursuing as we're pursuing like fashion and design and architecture just in general.
Timeless is defined as an adjective that means not affected by the passage of time or changes in fashion, which I think it's interesting that fashion is included in there because at the end of the day, fashion is an ever changing cycle of seasons. But I was watching a Tyler the Creator interview one day and he said something very interesting. When he finally left LA and went to New York, he realized that the world was huge. It is so much bigger than what we experience in our daily lives. Liberty is a college campus, which means kids from all over the United States and some internationally even all coalesce into 1 mile radius. And even wider than that, many of us coalesce into one city that is about 80,000 people, if we're being generous. So, moving cities, even to a place like Lynchburg, even to a microcosm like Liberty University, is a universe apart from the town that Chris came from. So, being someone who came from out of this universe, I asked Chris to describe how he sees the city and how he sees his campus.
That would it depends on the part that of Lynchburg that you're talking about. When you're talking about like downtown, it's definitely got a more like modern historic vibe to it. And you'll see a lot of places in downtown Lynchburg that are like repurposed old buildings that have been sort of refurbished and taken care of to sort of keep the character of the original, while also bringing in modern conveniences or making it accessible in a way that people can go eat food there and different stuff like that. So you'll see a lot of sort of refurbished places like that. And then there's other parts of Lynchburg that are can probably be described as like stuck in the past, just in the sense that it's old places that have been kept the exact way they are and haven't really changed much. It just depends on which part. It definitely has I think the term they use is like a colonial feel to it, with the way they use bricks and different stuff like that. in most of the architecture around, and a lot of it's very cohesive. Like there's not like one building that seems like dramatically different than the rest. They're all very similar to each other and all sort of complement each other really well. Um, and they all probably bring an air of like nostalgia to the place that I think Liberty is pretty good at like cultivating.
Quick little history lesson for everyone listening who doesn't know much about Lynchburg. It was founded by a man named John Lynch, and while it has a rather unfortunate name, he was, will be generous and call him an abolitionist. He did actually have slaves. He ended up freeing them of his own volition, which I don't know how much praise you give for that, but he did end up freeing them and did actually end up working against the institution of slavery. But when we are talking about old and repurposed and all these different things, we are not talking about the 1970s. As you could tell that I was talking about slaves, um, this city was recognized and founded before, but recognized by Virginia in the year 1786. So these old things being repurposed go back hundreds of years. At this point in examining the design and look and feel of Liberty's campus and Lynchburg, the city itself, we began to come home to the heart of this series. What about a place inspires and influences its people? So I asked Chris, can you define a Liberty fashion? Can you define a Lynchburg fashion? And maybe through that, we'll be able to gain some insight on the unique offerings of this city.
I think that Liberty has pretty distinct groups when it comes to like the students. You'll have a lot of younger students that are more, knowledgeable of like the surrounding sort of general popular culture that will bring in aspects of that when it comes to fashion. And then there's also other subsets of Liberty students that are coming from more, you could say, like sheltered households where they aren't as aware of the general sort of popular culture that happens. And so they come with a more like older style of clothing. And so it's very interesting to be around campus and seeing just like all these different groups somehow living together. And it just shows how, where we come from, influences how we are now. You'll have some students, like I said, that are more, whether homeschooled or um, sheltered in the sense of like, these might be people who aren't on social media and therefore aren't influenced by influencers that are found on social media, whether it's just like fashion influencers, bigger brands and stuff like that that utilize social media as the way of getting their message out there. These people aren't going to be affected by that because they're not partaking in that, and so their fashion will be probably mostly decided by parents. They'll see what their parents are wearing and stuff like that, and maybe copy that in some sense, or the smaller groups of friends that they have, they'll get their fashion cues from that and sort of stick with that. They won't probably be introduced to as many newer cues when it comes to fashion until they get to a place like this where they actually see new things and can either change or stick to what they've already know. And then there's probably the group that is on social media that is influenced by different different brands or different people or influencers on that can influence their style, and so they sort of keep closer to trends um, and implement those into their like daily fashion. So and some of those trends, like currently, like the most recent ones have been more like vintage trends, bringing in stuff from like the a little bit of the 70s, a little bit of the 90s, especially like the 90s to early 2000s, especially with like more oversized things and stuff like that. A lot of that mostly started, being propagated on like social media and stuff like that, and then people started sort of incorporating that into their, normal fashion. Downtown, you'll definitely see a lot more of a trendy sort of vibe with people. because again, social media has such just a big influence on that, because you'll probably find a correlation between people who utilize social media to find new experiences and find new things to do, and people who go to downtown and different stuff like that. There's going to be a correlation there, especially because businesses in downtown utilize social media to get the word out and stuff like that for their business. And it's sort of like when we were talking about fashion earlier. I mean, there's going to be people who utilize social media to find things to do, and there's people who don't, who and when people don't utilize those sort of things, they solely rely on word of mouth and and stuff like that when it comes to the businesses. And all that to say is, they're going to be dressing like what they thought was cool when they were young, when they were developing their sort of sense of fashion. Um, and so, you'll get a lot of older people who are just, dressing the same way as they always do, who don't feel as much of a need to fit to current like trends and stuff like that, just because, they have their probably stable relationships and friends and stuff like that, and don't feel the need to have to impress others. And so they just, sort of stick to what they already know. And so I guess the image I have in my mind is just, older people who dress in like collared shirts, um, longer dresses when it comes to ladies and stuff like that. Just sort of dress in what makes them feel comfortable, and not really worrying as much about impressing others.
For such a small city, there's a lot going on here, but there are some themes that I notice being repeated, and I hope that you all notice them being repeated as well. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to listen to this episode again. But I think that they can be encapsulated into some kind of ethereal ideas, so I hope you'll bear with me. In science, time and space are always linked together. Gravity doesn't just bend space, it bends time. They are inextricably linked. And I think, as far as our fashion journeys go, time and space are also linked together. Chris's story and description of Lynchburg reflects independence. They're pockets that lag behind the trends of the world, or in some cases, are involved in the trends of the world. All these things are how he views the city of Lynchburg. And much like how he, by being in a private school and choosing not to engage in certain things, became cut off from trends, it made him who he was. He mentioned that all he saw was sneaker culture, and because he didn't know much else, when he came to Lynchburg and he had the ability to see other things, he gravitated so heavily towards it because the people that he saw as cool, which was a limited number, wore certain sneakers and were involved in sneaker cultures. Independence is not always bad. As Chris mentioned at the end of his description of the people of Lynchburg and how they dress, being comfortable and not worrying about other people, to me, is a good thing, something that we should all strive for. But perhaps a fierce independence creates equally as fierce of icons. People are hypercritical of influencers and all these other things, but you're going to fill a slot with something, whatever you think is cool. And whatever you think is cool is dictated by your space, your time. For Chris, in his story, it was pillars like fear of God. He drifted towards their palettes and minimalism. For myself, I have a closet that attempts to mash a distinct number of different concepts together and reflect that I feel like I have many sides. And I don't do that because I'm more sophisticated than Chris. I do it because in my fashion story, which I'll tell at some point in time, and that I'm still going through, I thought a lot of people were cool. In particular, people like Tyler the Creator. I also liked Fear of God. The influence of early Virgil, early Off-White is undeniable in streetwear. I began following people on Instagram like Tim DeSaint and Devin on Deck. I would encourage you all to consider your own aesthetic choices and discover how where you came from and who you are is laid bare in what you put on. Timelessness is an endless search, like Chris mentioned. And for each of us, it's been dictated by the space and time that we grew up in and developed in. But I didn't expect any of this to come from an examination of a city like Lynchburg. I think Chris puts it best.
I think it's also a place too that has a lot of like hidden depths to it that you only really find as you're here longer. It's not really a place that you can sort of just show up and find everything that there is to do just in your first couple of years.
Much like the city of Lynchburg, each of us has hidden depths. Whether you care about what you wear or you think you don't care about what you wear, every time you get dressed, you are expressing a part of yourself. And I'm not asking you to change what you wear, and I'm not asking you to even start caring about fashion. But I am asking you to care about what's inside. Because no matter what, what's on the inside will find its way out.
Now that's love. I mean, real love.
Thank you so much for tuning in. A big shout out to Chris for agreeing to do this interview, the first of many. Music is by Paris Jones. You can find him on Apple Music, Spotify, wherever you get your music. Be sure to run it up.
It's that you when a lot doing donuts with your friends. Is that you mix the coke in a hand? It's that you putting dro in the wind. Is that you trying to get your hands on the cashews? Cause you know cash rules things around me. Is that